What's up everybody, my name is Beastfury, and welcome to my even more belated 5.0 PvE Annihilation and Watchman guide. This guide should be a bit shorter than my Carnage guide as I covered a lot of the general stuff in that video. If you haven't checked out that video already, I encourage you to do so, but I can understand if you just want to learn how to start dotting things up. Also, I'll mention now that the rotation is largely the same as the 4.0 rotation, with the exception that Ravage is now only 1 GCD instead of 2. So you now have 1 extra GCD to use in the rotation. Other than that, if you know the 4.0 rotation, you basically already know this rotation. Once again, this video will use imp side terminology, so keep that in mind if you're playing on the Republic side. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, let's start off with those pros first. First and foremost, the spec has very good single target sustained DPS. With proper uptime on bosses, this spec will really shine with its constant upkeep of dots and annihilate to buff up the damage of those dots. This spec also brings a lot of self-heals, along with a small bit of group healing to the table. With our dots and berserk, we can constantly stream a small amount of heals, which will help the healers keep you, as well as the group, alive throughout the encounter. Annihilation also brings a good amount of sustained AoE DPS with its dot spread, as well as the ability to bounce dots back and forth between targets for a DPS increase. Lastly, and this one can be a bit subjective, but it has a relatively easy rotation to follow since, once you set it up from your opener, you're basically just hitting everything on cooldown. Alright, about those cons. So with this spec, my number one complaint is that there's a massive setup to get the rotation to start flowing smoothly. The opener consists of a whopping 20 GCDs until you get to the point that you reach the repeatable section of the rotation. Something that also kind of goes along with that is that the rotation is fairly finicky and is very easy to mess up. It's not a hard rotation at all, in fact quite the opposite, like I said before, but it is something that is very easy to mess up and will take you from an optimal rotation to very suboptimal real quick as you scramble to try to get back to being able to pop all of your abilities on cooldown again. One simple mess up, like using Vicious Slash, where you didn't have the rage for it because Annihilate and Deadly Saber are coming back off cooldown, thus requiring you to hit Assault to use both abilities, is enough to throw off the rotation by a massive degree. Basically what I'm saying is, it's easy to perform, and just as easy to fuck up. This spec also utilizes stacks of both Juyo and Annihilate to increase your DPS. Juyo with a % damage increase along with some other crit benefits in the spec, and Annihilate stacks to reduce the cooldown of that ability. Though the devs have increased the length of time before these stacks fall off, there are still occasions where you may not have the ability to keep up these stacks, and losing them can be absolutely devastating to your DPS, as you basically have to start the entire rotation over with that 20 GCD opener. Lastly, its single target and AoE burst is by far the weakest of the 3 Marauder specs. There are points in the rotation where you can align or alter your rotation slightly to give more burst to burn down something that needs to die quickly, but it's not even going to compare to the burst of Fury and Carnage. So for our stats, we're going to be rocking that 1 accuracy enhancement and 3 accuracy augments for that 765 accuracy rating. Then we bring out 1594 crit with 3 crit enhancements and 6 crit augments. Last is our alacrity, which was set at 1876 with 6 alacrity enhancements and 5 augments. As I mentioned in my Carnage video, essentially if you're swapping from Carnage to this spec or Carnage to Fury, you take out 2 crit enhancements you have in your gear and replace them with alacrity enhancements so that we break that rounding threshold to hit that 1.3 second GCD. As far as utilities go, rather than discuss them on this video, I'm just going to redirect you to my Carnage video where I went fairly in-depth about utilities. So the link to that specific timestamp is down in the description below if you want to go check that out. Alright, let's get into the single target rotation. So this is what we're looking at with this rotation. Bear with me a little bit because the rotation consists of a 20 GCD opener followed by 4 different blocks that we cycle through, and I needed to create 2 different charts. Now when we look at this opener, the abilities we see here need to be hit on these specific GCDs, as this is when they come off cooldown and will align to a very clean rotation when we reach the blocks. Note the empty squares in both of these charts. These are going to be your filler abilities that will be the main focus of most of our discussion. Alright, so when going through your rotato, your goal is always going to be to keep your hardest hitting abilities on cooldown. The only thing that's going to fluctuate is your use of filler abilities. So there's a bit of RNG with this spec in terms of your rage management. Every time one of your bleeds deals damage, you have a 20% chance to build one rage. Since you'll literally always have a bleed on the target, that means each second you have a 20% chance to build one additional rage. Then, whenever your direct damage attacks crit while you have a bleed up, you build one rage as well, but can only happen once every 3 seconds. You'll need to monitor your rage semi-closely at all times to be able to make a quick decision as to which filler you can afford to spend your resource on. So first up is our filler Force Scream. Out of all these fillers, this one is going to deal the most damage, but also has the highest rage cost by far. Basically, it's double the cost of Vicious Slash, but for only a slight amount of increased damage. This ability will rarely be used, but you want to use it when you have a surplus of rage that needs to be burned off before Rend or Battering Assault becomes available. So, for instance, you're sitting at 9 rage. Battering Assault is 1 GCD away from coming off cooldown. You could Vicious Slash, but at best, you'd burn off 2 rage and be sitting at 7. Then Battering Assault would take you up over the cap of 12, and you'd mill 1 rage because you can't store more than 12 rage at a particular time. In this scenario, we can hit Force Scream to take us down to 5, then Battering Assault takes us back up to 11. The main DPS increase for this ability, though, is going to be after you apply your second stack of Deadly Saber. Then you get to delay the application of the third stack to squeeze a little bit of extra DPS out of Deadly Saber, because basically if you apply all 3 stacks immediately, there's about a 1 GCD period where you won't have any stacks of Deadly Saber on the boss. As for when to use Vicious Slash, basically if you have enough rage to burn, but you're not in a surplus amount where you would use Force Scream, we'll use this ability to help keep our DPS up. When we reach Execute phase, we basically just sub in Vicious Throw where we would normally use Vicious Slash, and we pay attention to the cooldown of that throw so that we know when we can use it again. Next up is Battering Assault. Now this ability is a little bit of a special case as we don't necessarily have it in a fixed position in our rotation, but it's something that ideally we want to keep, or at least keep close to, on cooldown. What that means is that when we have our filler blocks coming up, we want to do our best to have enough of a gap between our current rage and the cap where Battering Assault is coming off cooldown, so that we can almost immediately put it back on cooldown as it is our best rage generator. The last ability to talk about in this list is Assault. Now, this ability is the absolute lowest priority in our rotation. Ideally, we never even have to use it, but in cases where you simply don't have enough rage to hit your hardest hitting GCDs, and the RNG resource generation is failing you, from time to time you will find that you will need to hit an Assault to keep your rage at a sustainable level. So to recap, Force Scream when we have too much rage and need to burn some off, Vicious Slash when our rage is in a good spot and we can afford to burn a little off, Vicious Throw to replace Vicious Slash when the target is sub 30%, Battering Assault to build the largest amount of rage when we're low, ideally to be used close to on cooldown, and then Assault when our rage is too low for us to be able to use our best abilities. So talking about the AoE rotation for this spec, you'll notice that the only thing that really changes is that we add Smash and Sweeping Slash into our filler slots. That being said, what we use is actually going to vary drastically depending on how many targets we're talking about. In all AoE scenarios, Smash is our highest priority filler. With it, in a 2-target AoE situation, we want to be able to bounce dots back and forth between targets. This means that we apply our Rupture and Rend, then Smash to bounce them over to the second target. Then as soon as both Rupture and Rend have fallen off our main target, we Smash again to bounce the dots back over, and then reserve another smash, preferably right after the cooldown of smash is over, to bounce them back to the second target. Then we rinse and repeat, all while keeping the single target rotation up on the main target. Using this method, you'll see that you'll have an extra GCD to work with, as you'll no longer need to worry about having to reapply Rupture and Rend over two separate GCDs. Keep in mind, though, that the rage generation on Rend will be lost in this scenario. If you really want to take it to the next level, you can target swap to keep Rend up at all times, making Smash an actual replacement for Rupture. As for the other fillers, with two targets, we'll still keep the same system going as we had with the single target rotation, and don't even worry about Sweeping Slash. Once we start getting into 3 or more targets, however, then things get interesting. With the Path Carver utility, the threshold for when Sweeping Slash becomes a greater DPS substitute than Vicious Slash is at 3, and without it, 4. At this point, you will most likely also throw out Force Scream, so it's one less thing to manage. Not to mention the fact that if you add one more add, Sweeping Slash actually deals more damage than Force Scream anyway. In this situation, bouncing dots is actually not going to be the greatest DPS increase for you anymore. What you'll actually want to do instead is keep up your rotation on the main target, replacing Vicious Slash with Sweeping Slash, and just dot spread off of your main target to keep higher uptime of your dots on as many different targets as possible. If you try to bounce dots, what ends up happening is you'll have 3 or more targets surrounding you, you'll dot spread off your main target, then when you bounce them back to that main target, you'll have about a 6-second period where your dots will no longer be ticking on all those adds while you wait for Smash to come off cooldown, so you can bounce the dots back onto them. Once we start getting into the 6+ add range, then we can start throwing out Vicious Throw as well, so that all we're doing is either using Smash, Sweeping Slash, Battering Assault, or Assault as our filler abilities. So that about wraps up this edition of the Annihilation and Watchman guide. With 6.0 on the horizon, I hope to be able to update both the Carnage and the Annihilation videos again, but we'll see. Until then, have fun and happy maraudering.